I'm Brie the Plant Lady, and I wanted to take a minute and show you how to make your own custom succulent potting mix. Now you can buy potting mixes that are made for succulents, however I find that they are actually not exactly what my succulents prefer. So I've started doing this. I use equal parts of these three ingredients, starting with my soil cube. I also like to add ground aged pine bark. This is frequently sold in box stores as soil conditioner. And then finally, the white stuff, also known as perlite. So what I'm gonna do is mix equal parts of each of these into my wheelbarrow, and then I'll be ready to start potting up my succulents in preparation of overwintering. So the first thing I'm gonna do is open my bag of soil cube up. Dump that into my wheelbarrow. Now the soil cube alone is way too dense for growing succulents, especially in containers. However, what you're doing is adding more large particles to help break up that delicious black cake mix compost. So I'm going to use about an equal part, at least in estimation. And I'm going to go ahead and mix the soil cube and the aged pine bark together, making sure that it's really well incorporated. This is where working in a wheelbarrow is so great because you have lots of extra room. Now the final addition to make sure that this soil is really well drained is the perlite. And you have to be aware with perlite because it's dry and it can have this kind of horrible dust that you don't want to breathe in. So mix your perlite very gently. Allow that dust to float off. You see, ultimately what we're going to get here is this really nice, sharply drained, but hold enough humidity because of the addition of the soil cube that you can let your plants go, and whether it rains or not, they are going to be able to have enough moisture to get through in any climate. That's what I love about this. And I think that's one thing about making your own soils, especially for containers, is such a good thing because you have more control. You know your own habits. You know how often you're going to be able to water. So when you make up a soil that's, really well drained, you have to do that knowing like you're going to pair the right plants and you're going to have essentially the right irrigation system or irrigation habits. This is what I'm really looking for. Nicely well drained, all three elements mixed together. Perfect for transplanting succulents into.